The COVID-19 pandemic has forced governments around the world to borrow and spend at an almost unprecedented rate. Between April and June, America alone has borrowed $3 trillion, the largest amount borrowed in a single quarter since records began.
The rise in public debt has been unlike anything we've seen in recent history.
In the past, economists have warned against high levels of borrowing. But new thinking suggests much higher levels of debt might now be sustainable.
The fact that there's been such a dramatic change in the consensus makes some people nervous.
How much of a cause for concern should the world's rising public debt be? Governments have borrowed to finance their spending for hundreds of years. At the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815, Britain's debt was 164% of GDP. And after the Second World War, it was even higher at 259% of GDP.
Historically, governments have borrowed for a few main reasons. Probably the biggest one was to fight wars. But in the past 100 years or so, governments have increasingly used their debt as a way to try to keep the economy on track.
To raise money, governments issue bonds to investors. These are, in effect, IOUs that are repaid over a fixed term with interest at a rate that depends on the length of the bond. How desirable these bonds are to investors depends on the country's credit worthiness.
They tend to be very safe assets. With governments, you can usually count on getting your money back. Once a bond has been sold by the government out into the market, it can be swapped and traded as many times as people care to. And that gives you a sense of how markets view the credit worthiness of the government.
Government bonds are bought by many different investors, including pension funds, hedge funds, banks, and individual investors, as well as a country's own central bank and local government. Foreign governments also buy bonds. The biggest foreign holders of America's public debt are China and Japan.
If you have a safe asset that everyone will accept, like US government bonds, you can sell those bonds in a crisis, get dollars, and then use that to make sure you don't get into trouble. So there's quite a lot of potential buyers out there for government bonds, and really they could end up all over the world.
Governments' willingness to issue bonds and increase public debt has changed over time. After the sky-high debts of the Second World War, many governments were wary of going further into the red. But they continued to borrow, and in the 1970s, this was blamed for high inflation.
A lot of economists spoke to governments and said, the reason you're facing these high rates of inflation is because you're borrowing so much. It's adding too much money into the economy for the economy to easily absorb, and it's pushing up prices. That really ushered in a sea change in the way that governments think about debt, and so the use of borrowing as a macroeconomic tool slowly petered out until we got to the global financial crisis.
Now it's official, we are in a recession.
Major financial institutions have teetered on the edge of collapse, and some have failed.
In the rich world, the financial crisis pushed public debt from 74% to around 105% in the decade following the financial crisis. And in emerging economies, it rose from roughly 35% to 48% of GDP. This ballooning debt caused political panic, with some governments pursuing strict austerity to try to bring their budget deficits down during the decade that followed. But it didn't go entirely to plan.
By about 2014, the lessons of that experiment began to be pretty clear. And what we learned was austerity in a time of economic weakness hurts economies so much that it basically doesn't do any good. The economy becomes so weak that you're not earning enough in tax revenues to make it worth it.
These problems with austerity led to new thinking. In 2019, former IMF chief economist Olivier Blanchard gave a game-changing speech. He argued governments could borrow far more than previously believed.
I think the fact that there's been such a dramatic change in the consensus makes some people nervous, but at the same time, it wasn't a rash decision they made. It was heavily influenced by what was going on in the world around them.
Blanchard observed interest rates on government bonds have been falling, making it cheap for some governments to borrow money. At the same time, the economy was growing. Take America. The rate of nominal GDP growth, which is GDP before it's been adjusted for inflation, has generally been higher than interest rates for the past 30 years. This matters because as long as GDP is growing faster than the country's debt is accumulating interest, and governments keep additional borrowing in check, then a nation can effectively grow its way out of debt at no fiscal cost.
Mathematically, it's a very straightforward point. But when you're explaining this to governments and saying, this is how it goes, that ends up being quite a powerful thing.
Not even a year after Blanchard gave his speech, coronavirus emerged in Wuhan, and the greatest exercise in public borrowing for generations began.
Government borrowing hit a record £55 billion.
Ballooning public debt.
Around $300 billion, or 16% of GDP.
But not every country can borrow its way through the pandemic.
Almost every government has found it easier to borrow now than it was 30 or 40 years ago. But the difference between a rich country and a poorer country, which doesn't have a long record of borrowing on foreign markets, those places can't get the same interest rates. It's a source of significant inequality in terms of how countries face this pandemic, that some places can borrow almost as much as they want to support their economies and others can't.
Borrowing on this scale is not without risk for anyone.
You owe us a lot of money. What?
As there's always the threat that interest rates could rise again. Economists aren't entirely sure why these rates have been low for so long. In general, interest rates on mortgages, government bonds, or savings accounts are driven by demand. If the desire to save is high, then interest rates will be low, as banks or governments issuing bonds don't have to tempt investors with favourable rates. There are several factors driving the desire to save, which might be keeping interest rates down. The ageing population might be one cause, as people tend to save for retirement, and pension funds buy government bonds. And fear of global financial instability may also play a part, causing investors to seek safe assets like bonds.
We can't be completely sure why exactly it's happened, and that matters because if you can't be certain why it happened in the first place, you can't say for sure that it's not going to reverse itself at some point in the future, which would be a big deal. You know, if interest rates suddenly soared, then all the countries that had accumulated a lot of debt would suddenly be in very big trouble.
Despite these risks, the pandemic has left many countries with no option but to keep borrowing. To cut deficit spending now, while the global economy is still crippled by the pandemic, would inflict lasting damage. But how much and how long countries can continue to borrow is unclear. And the colossal debt built up in the past 6 months will be one of the greatest legacies of the pandemic.